So diving into Luke 16, and I was going to share with you how much this is integrated with the previous chapter. First, I think we've got to think about a little bit about what this parable of the unjust manager means. People are puzzled by it, partly because we don't always expect Jesus's take to be so outrageous. So in a sense, if we allow that the response of the shepherd is an outrageous response, and the response of the woman who's found the coin is an outrageous response, we're not against the rules of society, but it's simply absolutely over the top. You might be less troubled by why the person who's been cheated out of money would actually commend the person who cheats him out of money. I mean, there are various models in which you could think about that. It could be that it's about public face, that the way it works, he says, come in, sit down and change your version of how much you owe. So he's handing him his archival copy, his signature then on that document shows that he owes less. And it may be a sort of untraceable crime after all. If that's the original copy, that's fine. Does the manager, not the manager, the owner, even know that he's been cheated out of money? Or is it that everyone knows that he's owed more, but actually it looks like he's being super generous and he doesn't want to back out of it looking like he's being super generous? There are different models on this. But what we can say is that the key axis of comparison in Jesus' story is this, that he's addressing his disciples in 16 verse 1. He says, you are people who are on notice, effectively, or you are like somebody who's on notice. That this manager has a very limited time period during which they still get to control the assets of their boss. And in that, they do one really key thing, and that is make friends. And that's the point of comparison. And therefore, I tell you, verse 9, make friends for yourself by means of unrighteous wealth, because you can go on, and the next story is going to be about someone who had angelic friends, who welcomed him into Abraham's bosom. And so I think that seems to be the point of comparison. We then find that there are difficulties as we go through verses 14 through to 18 in trying to find what's the point of coherence here. It seems to be a bit all over the place. Pharisees love money, then they justify themselves before men, but what's high is actually an abomination with God, which is a really bad word for ultra uncleanness. Remember that Pharisees are spending all their day trying to be clean. We then go on to the law and the prophets, verse 16, and everyone's sort of pushing into the kingdom. And then we've got something about divorce. Then we've got something about the last story, which is the temporarily rich man and Lazarus. We're going to have to do that story first in order to work through what's actually going through on earlier. So let's begin with chapter 16 and verse 19. There was a rich man. First thing you notice is there's two stories in a row which begin there was a rich man. 16 verse 1, 16 verse 19. There's a rich man who had a manager who's accused of unrighteous management, and there's a rich man, and what do we learn about him? He was clothed in purple. That's interesting. Royal colour. And he is celebrating every day. That word celebrate has run through chapters 15 and 16. You never gave me a young goat so I could celebrate my friends. Or we had to celebrate him with a goat because this your brother was dead and alive again, lost and found. And what we find is that he is wearing, we don't know much about him, he's rich, he's wearing purple and linen, and he's feasting every day. Okay. Where do we get purple and linen in the Bible together? Is there any place that we get purple and linen in the Bible together? Well, yes, there is. Esther chapter 1. And so if we think in terms of expert scribes and what they might think, Esther chapter 1 verse 6, you read, there was white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars. Now, what's the context of that? It's a feast for every day where Xerxes / Ahasuerus is running a feast for 180 days in his palace, and at the end he invites all of the men, to a feast. But the point is, he invites all of them, and it's quite interesting that this rich man does not invite everyone. It's quite striking the way he only has, he doesn't have the poor man, for instance. And there he is. And it seems when you get to the end of verse 19, this guy is living in excess. He is literally having a feast every day. And then there's a poor man, and we're given the poor man's name. This is again part of Jesus' storytelling. Rich man given no name, although you assume everyone would know his name. Poor man given a name because he's known to God in a sense. He's more important in God's eyes. So it's the same sort of feature you saw. In a sense, we've got the reversal between near and far in chapter 15. It's the undermining of some of the structures you might think. The person who's physically close is further away, emotionally closer. Here we've got the same sort of reversal going on, where someone who is rich, you expect to be well known, we don't know his name. Poor person, we know his name. And then we have, with this most amazing economy, he had been placed or had been cast at the gate of the rich man. Think about that. What that tells us is this man is disabled. He has a mobility disability, and he has been laid at a strategic place. So he didn't even get there himself. Now, Jesus hasn't told us he's got a disability. He just gives us information that means that conclusion is inevitable. This guy can't actually move. It has to be put there by others. And where's he been put? He's been put at the rich man's gate. Now, a key thing here is that these houses generally just have one gate. Therefore, that's the place that the rich man has to go in and out of all the time. It's an amazing place in terms of begging potential, because the rich man has to go past it all the time. And there he is. So that was a well-chosen spot. And then we read that he's covered with sores. Who in the Bible is covered with sores? Job. Was Job rich or poor? Rich, okay. Now, feasting every day. Where else have we had feasting every day in the Bible, apart from Xerxes? Job's children. Job's children used to, and this is not everyone's reading, but the way I read it is you've got a 7-day week, you've got 7 sons, and they have a feast, each one on his day, and then they cycle around again. Okay? And so one reading you can have of Job chapter 1, they've got 3 sisters, remember 7 brothers, and they invite their sisters. They have a sibling-only feast. That's a key aspect of what they do. And obviously Job also does a sacrifice for them once a week at the end. So that's a sort of echo that there could be in this. And then we read, he longed to be filled. When did we last come across the phrase longed to be filled? Prodigal son. He longed to be filled with what the pigs ate. Okay? This man longs to be filled with what fell from the rich man's table, but along come the dogs. Okay? Now notice here, pigs and dogs in chapter 15 and 16. Where have we seen pigs and dogs in Jesus' teaching? Don't cast your pearls before swine. Don't give what's holy to the dogs. That's in Matthew 7. That's only in Matthew 7. That's in Jesus' mind in Matthew 7. The same mind here in Luke 15 and 16. You see, these 2 unclean animals back to back, long to be filled, unclean animal. So again, this is all part of the argument that this doesn't come from Luke, although Luke 15 and 16 fit phenomenally well within the themes of Luke's gospel. And I'm absolutely going to concede that. When you look at what Jesus is doing elsewhere, you realise it's far easier to explain it's all that's coming from Jesus, because it's got rabbi knowledge, it's got local measurements, it's got deep knowledge of the Old Testament, and it's got features of Jesus' teaching in other Gospels. And that's a really key element. Therefore, all of this smartness comes from Jesus, and all of this economy of words in storytelling. So this story is less than 2 minutes, this story of the temporarily rich man and Lazarus. I say temporarily rich man and Lazarus, that's not the way it's normally called, because he's never called rich man after he gets to Hades. Just one of those things like the Pharaohs learned the hard way. You can't take, the money with you. And so it's just interesting, again, Jesus telling a story by omission. So he longs to be filled with what fell from the table of the rich man, that sense of abundance, like the sense of extra bread that we had in the last story, or the story before, and the dogs came and they licked his sores. That's an interesting thing, because how do you lick? You lick with your tongue. So we're going to find tongue coming up again in this. And of course, you could say that when a dog licks your sores, those sores burn. And we're going to find burning and tongue coming up soon, okay? Anyway, the poor man died first. Poor people usually do live shorter lives. So in Jesus' story, there's just this subtle thing where he's observing reality. By the way, you noticed that bit? I always feel a bit nervous saying this, but please take this the right way. In chapter 15, the shepherd, a man, says, I found a sheep that was lost. The woman, a woman, says, I found the coin that I had lost. Anyone find that funny? In terms of blame accepting? No. I mean, like, I walk around town and I bump into women all the time. They always apologise, or most of them. It's really quite striking, anyway. So there's this sort of human psychology level, even at the very subtle fine-tuning of details there. But again, not overplayed like I just overplayed that. Even by mentioning that, I've slightly done more than Jesus does, right? But I just want you to observe these tiny perturbations in the storytelling. So what we have is the poor man died and was received by the angels. He gets VIP treatment and goes to Abraham's bosom. Okay. What is Abraham's bosom? Well, who is Abraham? He's a normal guy. How tall is he? Yeah, between 5 and 6 feet. I don't know how tall Abraham is, but he's a normal-sized Abraham. That's a really important thing, because some people think that Abraham's bosom is some sort of metaphor for, heaven, right? But it's not. Bosom was a word that we used to have in Bible translations. We don't tend to. I've actually, in the ESV committee at the time, we were actually taking bosoms out of men's bosom out of the Bible. Because what used to happen is you used to have it in John 1:18, the only son who's at the father's side nowadays with a common translation, or you would get the beloved disciple in John being in the bosom of Jesus. Now the point is this: the way you eat, different from our dining table, you recline, and in that point, so you recline, and your bosom, it isn't your lap, because lap's too vertical for us. It really is the entire sort of arc made by the front of your body, and one person lies next like that. So effectively, there's only one slot next to Abraham. Only one slot, and who gets it? The poor man. Now, of all the people you could feast with in the Bible, who would you most want to feast with? I would take Abraham top over anyone, over Adam, over David. Abraham. I mean, he's not only just, the feasty type character, but just in terms of where he sits within the biblical story, he's above Moses. I mean, Abraham is the only person ever called friend of God. Moses is God's servant, because he says, Moses, do this, do that. Abraham is his friend because he shows him his plans. That's a key connection you have in the idea of friend in the Bible, is that a friend involves information sharing, which is why in Psalm 25, friend or secret are different renderings of the same word, right? Because your friends know your secrets, and you'll see different translations in Psalm 25. Or it's why Jesus says, I no longer call you servants, I call you friends, because I'll tell you what I'm doing. Okay? So he tells Abraham his plan, therefore Abraham's his friend. Abraham will be the guy to dine next to, and guess who gets to dine there? It's Lazarus. how outrageous. So he gets his VIP treatment, is carried into the bosom of Abraham. Contrast verse 22, second half. The rich man died and was buried. Oh, quite final there. And it doesn't tell you Lazarus ever got buried. Now, you could overread it to say he didn't get buried. That's overreading it. Jesus doesn't say whether he got buried or not. I mean, you can imagine loads of people would be there for the rich man's funeral. That's what happens. The poor man died early. And then, or did he die of starvation or did he die of sores? I'm not quite sure. But the thing is, we don't hear that he got buried. And that's probably the more important thing. The way Jesus will create asymmetry is not just rich man was buried, poor man was not buried. It's actually more subtle than that. It's just to tell you one side and allow you to explore the possibilities of the other side. And that's all part of just the brilliance of a storyteller. So there we are, and the rich man is now in Hades. Now, Jesus talks about Hades on 3 occasions. He also talks about Gehenna. Hades is a Greek word, Gehenna is an Aramaic word, and Hades can conjure up all sorts of things, let's say, from the Greek world, where with the Greek underworld, they've got quite a detailed geography. You know, they've got a sort of going rate for going across the river Styx on the boat and, you know, all that sort of stuff. And, you know, Cerberus the dog. Jesus conjures up not that, but there's something the Greeks got right. And that is the sense of comeuppance. That, you know, people who committed a particular sort of crime would have a particular sort of punishment, okay? And so Jesus isn't buying into all the superstitious, elaborate geography of the Greek world, but he is saying, here's we got the rich man, he's in Hades, he lifts up his eyes, he's in torture, and he sees Abraham afar off and Lazarus at his side. Where in the Bible do we get someone lifting up their eyes? Well, quite a few times. Where do we get someone lifting up their eyes and seeing something afar off? Someone lifted up their eyes and saw something afar off. Sorry? Stephen, yeah, okay. That's New Testament. Anyone in the Old Testament? Someone lifted up Abraham. Abraham, yeah. So guess what? Lifted up eyes, saw afar off. Abraham. We got 4 things together. Lift up eyes. See far off and Abraham. I'll take that as 5 if you like. That all coming together. Genesis 22. Abraham will lift up his eyes and saw afar off the mountain. Now notice we've got the word far off here, just as we have far off in chapter 15. It's one of the words that linking things together. Now, Job was rich, yeah? Abraham, rich or poor? Rich, okay. So we've actually got 2 rich men in this story other than the man who was temporarily rich, okay? And the point is, Job's fine, you know, Abraham's fine, there's nothing wrong with being rich, but there is a problem with being rich this way, the way he had been. So he looks up, he sees afar off. Oh, there's only one other time you get someone lifts up their eyes and sees afar off. Job's friends. Yeah? They lift up their eyes and they see Job afar off, Job chapter 2. So it's, in other words, if you're thinking as a scribe, it triggers those 2 same characters that you already can see a little bit encoded into this story. And he calls out, Father Abraham. Have we seen anyone call anyone father nearby? Yeah, younger son. How many times did he call Abraham father? Someone father? In the story, 3 times. How many times does the formerly rich man call Abraham father in this story? Don't look at me. Yeah.
3.
3, exactly right. We've got it there in verse 24. We've got it again in verse 30, and somewhere in the middle we've got it verse 27. Yeah. So you've got that 2 characters each calling someone father. You could, if you like, this might be overreading it, read the missing father in the older brother's speech, where he doesn't say father, as sort of the structure. That may be too much because these stories are slightly separated. But anyway, Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Well, you didn't do much mercy in your life, but okay. Have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water. Okay. Oh, Lazarus' name. That's interesting. He's just given away that he knew Lazarus' name. Send Lazarus. Now, there you are. You've lived at your nice address the whole time. And now you're in Hades, and you look up, and there are two people. One of whom you've encountered before, and one you haven't. Which one should you address?
What do you know?
Sorry? So you think you'd address the one you know. But no, he's a rich man. So he's going to talk rich man to rich man. But he's not a rich man anymore. Is he? He wants to sort of have a buddy talk with Abraham. Hey, you and me, we both well off. So no, he can't do that. But he's still thinking in this unrepentant way, because he's thinking that it is worth Lazarus. He's treating Lazarus like a slave, a lackey, to just get one drop of water on his finger and come all the way in order to quench the fire on his own tongue. Now, obviously, that shows you how desperate he is. That just the thought, how much relief of pain would that, how many milliseconds would that count? Almost nothing. How much water can you get on the tip of your finger? Just again, it's not even a milliliter. It's tiny amount. But he thinks that that's worthwhile. But you can see how proud he is, because he is thinking that it is worthwhile doing that, sending Lazarus all that way. And because here he is in agony in the flame. Well, Abraham replies, child. Exactly the same word, some people translate it as son, that the father said at the end of the story of the two sons. Remember, you had your good stuff in your life, and Lazarus likewise bad stuff. And now he's being comforted and you're in pain. There's a sort of, there's a reversal going on, but it's all fair. What's more, there is a big chasm. And the chasm exists for the weirdest possible reason you can imagine. The chasm exists to stop people going from the nice place to the bad place. Okay? So this is not like some, wall in Mexico or Gaza or whatever it is. This is a wall, a chasm to stop people coming from, so what it says is, so that they who come, so those who want to pass from here to you may not. That's the first reason. And secondly, they can't come from you to us. There are people, can you believe it, who would leave bliss, glory, to rescue others. There is one supremely who would do that, of course, Jesus Christ. And so transform others that they would want to do the same were it not for the construction of the wall. Think about that. Think about, the sort of the wall to stop Texans going into Mexico. Is that what it exists for? That's crazy, but it's not that Mexico's that bad. I've got a Mexican PhD student, but you understand. The logic of this is really quite shocking. So he said, okay. No, he didn't say okay. He said, Father, I've got another question. Now, this is where we see that the rich man is not a narcissist. You might want to think he's a narcissist. No, he's not. He actually is a family man. He cares for his family. He would actually prefer for his family not to be in Hades than to be with him in Hades. And that makes him less of a sort of caricature than you might think. He's actually someone who wants his family not to be there with him. So he asks again, okay, again about the chasm. I've been, told that, but what about going to earth? Can you send him to earth, to the house of my father? Because I have 5 brothers, and then let him testify, and then they won't come to this absolutely awful place. Quite striking, really, because we imagine this man has been wealthy and he's been feasting every day, but he's not been feasting alone. He has his brothers round. How many brothers does he have? 5. Why do you think he has 5 brothers?
Because Job.
Sorry?
Job's son.
Right, okay, yeah. That's sort of in the story terms, but okay. What's he calling Abraham? How many children does Abraham have? Sorry? More than you can count. So you can't actually call Abraham your father and make such a big mathematical mistake. He goes to hell because he makes a mathematical mistake. You get that, don't you?
No, yeah.
He goes to hell because he makes a mathematical mistake. He thinks he's only got 5 brothers. Mm-hmm. If you want to call Abraham your father, you have to recognize Lazarus as your brother. What was the story about the 2 sons about? It was about the older brother has to recognize the younger son is his brother. The scribes and Pharisees have to recognize the tax collectors and sinners who come to Jesus are their siblings. You see, it's the same idea running through all these at a really deep level. And what's more, if you'd read the 5 books of Moses, you might know that. So it really rubs that in. When he says, I've got 5 brothers, he is absolutely mathematically incorrect if Abraham is his father. But what he wants to do is claim Abraham as his father without having the obligations to brothers. And that's what's so striking in this story. So then he replies to Abraham replies, but hang on, I'm paraphrasing. They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. Let them listen. They're the one who has ears to hear. Listen. Remember, the scribes and Pharisees are grumbling, not listening to Moses. But no one knew the Bible better than the scribes and Pharisees. So they know the Bible super well, and they're not listening to it. They're not hearing it. Just as in John chapter 5, you search the scriptures because you think then you have eternal life. These are the things that testify about me. Jesus is making the same point in Luke's gospel that he makes over in John's gospel. By the way, more sign, it all comes from him. Okay? That here are people who know the Bible super well. Jesus is throwing lots of Bible references in to the story, and yet they're missing the fundamental point. And I find it very striking to have Abraham talking about Moses. I like this, anyway, but he said, no, Father Abraham, which is a really interesting thing to say to Abraham. No. Guess a lot of people don't do that very often. But he's trying to correct Abraham's theology. Abraham, you have your theology wrong. If only someone rises from the dead, then they'll believe. And Abraham replies, of course, if they don't believe the scriptures, they won't believe if someone rises from the dead. And of course, this story is set within a gospel which has its own story where someone does, in fact, rise from the dead. Now, let's then use the information from this story to read back over the other things. So when we have the story of the 2 sons, it says you've got a father and 2 sons. And the way it's portraying it is in chapter 15, verse 25, it says, his older son. We usually change the story and talk about the older brother, okay? So whereas the story is casting them more in terms of sons in relation to the father, we often, and there is some of that, we tend to concentrate more on the brotherly relationship. But there is this brother relationship that's absolutely key in this story. Then what we have is we have a story where we've got this manager, and it ends saying make friends. Then we have these various verses that we need to dig into about what's exalted, but we also have something about you cannot serve God and mammon. That's verse 13. You can't serve. You can't. So it's talking about service and slavery, or masters and slaves, as we've already had implied in the story before. And then we have the emphasis on friendship and brotherhood there in the final story, because the friendship is implied by the angels, that Lazarus had friends of the angels, so that's not used. We also know that Abraham is a friend of God, and we know it's talking about brothers as well as a father relationship. So you've got loads and loads of family relationships. So therefore, in verse 18, that weird verse about divorce, you think, why is that in the middle there? Well, that's the one set of relationships we haven't yet talked about, the spousal relationships. They are right at the center of this, but also divorce is something deeply connected with money, right? And all of these things are about money. Every single one of the 5 stories from chapter 15 through to 16 have a money element to them. So I hope you can see how these things all fit together. Does that make sense? And that's why some of these things hang together. So, any questions on this so far? All super clear. Good. So one of the things we can do is we can actually run through and just make sure we've checked off all of the links that there are between the stories. For instance, chapter 15, someone addresses someone as father 3 times. That's also in chapter 16. Chapter 15, someone wastes possessions. That's also in chapter 16. Chapter 15, we've got someone longing to be filled. That's also chapter 16. Chapter 15, we've got someone saying how much or how many. That's also chapter 16. Chapter 15, we have someone addressing themselves. Also chapter 16. Chapter 15, we have someone seeing afar off. Also chapter 16. Chapter 15, we have someone commanding to do something quickly. Also chapter 16. Chapter 15, we have someone saying celebrate. And that also goes on in chapter 16 as a person celebrates every day. We also have someone calling one of the lads in chapter 15 and calling each one of the debtors in chapter 16. And we have the word friends, so that I can celebrate with my friends in chapter 15 and also in chapter 16. Make friends. In both chapters, someone is addressed as child in the same thing. And in both cases, twice in chapter 16, 2 different stories, you've got someone called rich. There was a rich man. All of that tells you it has to be the same sort of creative mind behind the lot. Everyone happy with that? What do we know about the creative mind? We know that they know rabbinic parables. We know that they know the Old Testament. We know that they use particular sorts of measures which are only from the land of Jesus. And we know that they speak the way that Jesus speaks elsewhere. Therefore, the simplest hypothesis is that these come from Jesus. But there's a few more things to put that in, to emphasize that. One is, Jesus begins some of the stories with a question. The story about the sheep and the story about the coin begins a question. We know that Jesus begins lots of his stories with questions. Which of you will have a friend? Which father among you, if his son asks for a fish, which of you by worrying can add? Jesus is using questions all the time. That's a particular feature of his teaching, particularly at the beginning of a section. The way he ends a story. Chapter 15, verse 7, we have, thus there will be joy in heaven. Okay, so he ends with a thus. Jesus ends a story in over in another gospel, Matthew 18. Thus, it's not the will of your Father in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. Chapter 18, verse 14. Matthew 18, 14. How does he end the story of the 2 sons? He said it was necessary or fitting to celebrate. That also happens over in Matthew 18, story of the unforgiving servant. He says it was necessary or fitting for you to have mercy on your fellow servants. Exactly the same phrase. So we're getting these hallmarks of Jesus' teaching. We're seeing it with male and female pairs across all the different Gospels. We're seeing it in so many different ways. Even the emphasis of a person being more important than a sheep is something we see elsewhere in Jesus' teaching, and that's implied in the structure of Luke 15. So all of those things give you the fact that it has to come from Jesus. Now, let's think about this a little bit more. I've just so far talked about the stories of Jesus, but there's a whole lot of other stuff that you get in Jesus. I want to talk about his secular sayings now, okay, because we haven't even talked about that. There are a number of sayings of Jesus that are religious, if you like. Now, they're all religious at one level. Let's say an I am saying, it's about himself, okay? I am the bread of life. There are quite a few of his sayings I can take out of their context and which work as general world wisdom. So I'm going to call them secular sayings, like, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. Or, a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. Or, the truth will set you free. Okay, that's a saying ultimately about himself. But that's interesting because that's in John's Gospel and it's a genius saying. Like I've seen loads of people appeal to that. The fact that you could be hiding behind things and then the truth liberates you. People find that. And yet, that's a genius saying that's only in John's Gospel, but over in Matthew, you have love your enemies. So who comes up with all these sayings? Is it that the disciples, the second generation of disciples, or people after Jesus, start having all these most amazing meme ideas and then crediting them to Jesus? Is that the way it works? Well, no, that doesn't explain why you'd have some in John and some in Matthew, because you'd have to have lots and lots of disciples who are geniuses, all who come up with these ideas, and then decide not to take the credit themselves. They're going to put the credit to their master. That doesn't make any sense at all. Think how radical the teaching, love your enemies, is. Okay, so you get this in Matthew, love your enemies. As far as we can tell, no one in literary history had ever said that before. So for now, it might be quite commonplace because of Jesus' teaching, we get that. No one had ever said that before. It is so radical, and it just happens to arrive in written form just around the time that Jesus is, on earth. Wow, that's quite striking. Or the best form of the golden rule: do unto others what you have them do to you. Again, just astounding. The poor you will always have with you. That's a really interesting one. Because, of course, there's a right wing and a left wing take on that. The right wing take on that is, that's because the poor make themselves poor and do very poor things, and they're dumb. Right? And then you've got the left wing view, the poor you will always have you with you because the capitalists are always going to oppress them, that's why they're all going to be poor. Right? Jesus doesn't fall into either trap. To teach really well, you need really good understanding of the subject. Okay, just the master knows things so well that they can simplify it. So that's what Jesus does. He can look at human nature as a whole, take it all in and say, the poor you will always have with you. You see how clever that is. That's complete genius. And so things like turn the other cheek, just an amazing one-liner. Now, thinking about other people who say great things. So near here we have Blenheim Palace. I'm sure Churchill's probably been to this place as well. As part of the Spencer Churchill, family. Did Churchill ever come here? Do we know?
No, probably.
Probably. Yeah. I mean, he has some great liners, but Churchill's output is 8 to 10 million words. Okay. What's his most famous thing? I don't know. We will fight them on the beaches. Is that it? How useful is that today? Like right now. Not very useful. I mean, you can go find a beach quite away from here. But it's not that useful. Whereas what we're finding with Jesus' sayings is that they work, like the truth will set you free, will work in every context, every day. A house divided itself, a kingdom divided itself cannot stand, helps you every single day. And so when you think about something like the Lesson on the Mount, Matthew 5 through to 7, I would think that if you've been a Christian, you've been reading the Bible for quite a few years, you sort of have that memorized. Now, what I don't mean is that you would know what chapter and verse things were, or even that it was in Matthew 5 to 7. But if someone starts the mean, you'd be able to end it. Okay, that's what I mean. If someone starts a saying, more or less, you would know that. You know, blessed are the poor in spirit, and you'd have some sense of how to finish them off. And that's the genius, well, one of the elements of genius of Jesus' teaching. There's just so much of this. But that block of teaching is 12 minutes long. So we think about our best speakers, like Churchill. How could he, is there any 12-minute block of speech that he has that you could take so many timeless threads out of as you get with Matthew 5 through to 7? I just don't think there is or anything close. Shakespeare, somewhat quotable, I've never learned quite enough, but a quotation about, let's say, the brevity of life. You might have one or quite a few in Shakespeare, but then they're not that original. There's a sort of originality to the way he puts it, but the observation itself is not original. So it's not like the originality of love your neighbours. That's on a whole different level of originality because it's actually observing something entirely new. Now, Jesus doesn't just do this with original, mind-blowing stories, short and long, and with original, mind-blowing memes. He also does it with concepts. The concept of hypocrisy. Now, arguably, Jesus grew up within 4 miles of a theatre. So he's in Nazareth, and then you've got Sepphoris not far away, where there's a theatre. One of his favourite critiques of the Pharisees is that they are Greek theatre actors. So when he calls them hypocrites, we now define hypocrisy in a narrow way. So a hypocrisy is when, for instance, a politician criticises a opposition politician for doing exactly what they have just done, or something like that, or the other way. That's the sort of hypocrisy. Whereas for Jesus, it's something broader than that. It's generally putting the mask on, and it's faking. And Jesus is calling out this a lot. And whereas Pharisees spent their time separating from the pollutions of the sort of pagan culture, Jesus says you are just theatre actors, and theatre wouldn't be something that a Pharisee would even particularly go to. So all of that is quite a dig. But nowadays, we are using the word hypocrisy every day. Who first came up with the analytical concept of that? Well, it first arises with Jesus, and it's on his lips all the time, you hypocrites and so on. Now, then you look at the way he analyses things, and this is quite striking because he deals with a lot of cultural questions that are extremely relevant for today. So nowadays, we like to apologise for sins of the past. It's quite easy to apologise for sins of the past because it doesn't cost you anything. It's not that there weren't lots of sins of the past. So what I found is that I was actually listening to a debate, Cambridge Union debate, about the question of reparations, okay? And a very interesting debate. Because what I thought is we've got two sides here. We've got the pro-reparations side and the anti-reparation side. Let's start with the anti-reparation side. They, one of them even said, we've paid more than enough as reparations. Well, the problem is that's overestimating the righteousness of the past, right? The sins of the past are so big that no one could ever pay for them, or none of us, okay? Then you've got the pro-reparation side. They overestimate the righteousness of the present. Because as far as they're concerned, the present is currently righteous, the past is the bad time, okay?
So both groups, as I came away listening, they're both overestimating righteousness on the human side, just at different time periods, if that makes sense. Whereas what we should say is, wow, our sins are so big that we could never pay for them. If only there was someone who could pay the debt. And then you realise, yes, this is where we need a saviour from outside who can pay the debt. Now,
What happens with when Jesus is criticising the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 23? He starts calling them hypocrites, but he also says something very interesting, because he says that you build, this is Matthew 23 verse 29, you build the tombs of the prophets and you adorn the monuments of the righteous and say, if we were around in the days of our father, we would not have been partakers in the blood of the prophets. So you bear testimony that you are the children of those who killed the prophets. Guess what? You're the children, therefore you have the same nature. And so what we're finding is that people are wanting to do is to say, we would never have done what that generation in the past did. Those awful folk in whether it's the 17th, 18th, 19th century, it doesn't matter. You just choose a century other than your own and say, we wouldn't have done that. But hang on, you're testifying that you have the same nature. You are their descendants. Why would you think that you could ever escape from that nature? It's like, the new uncorrupt political party that starts up. We are anti-corruption. The first thing that's going to happen the moment they're in power, and we all know because we've been through the story, it can be a bit cynical by now, is they're going to have their own scandal. Okay? So, but Jesus undercuts this in such a striking way. He basically is talking to, if you like, the Pharisees and wokeness might not seem to sort of naturally align, but I think they do in some respects. These are people who think that their current generation is more righteous than the previous one. And Jesus absolutely criticizes that. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that he's got a place for those who are sort of, because at the same time, we could say about them that they're sort of conservative. There's another element to that, because they're building the monuments, celebrating the past. But guess what? They're celebrating the strands that they like to align themselves with. They like to align themselves with the prophets of the past, but actually, Jesus is saying, no, you align more with the other side. So what we're seeing then is that Jesus is, I hope seeing this, the most amazing storyteller. He is the most amazing meme sayer, and he's the most amazing analyst. And that's without us even getting into so much of his sayings, which are about salvation. Now, the Gospels, back to back, are about 9 hours long. I haven't actually done the count to work out exactly how long Jesus' teaching in red letters would be. I'm going to say 4.5 hours. But remember, there's some overlap between the Gospels. So in other words, we're actually talking about a much smaller group of teaching in which all of this genius is concentrated. Where can you find that? Where can you find a political speaker or anyone who in that little text can contain that much wisdom? So that's what I want to get over to you, that there's this genius of Jesus, and it's something that we've not really been emphasizing. That is, it's like a Mozart symphony or Da Vinci painting that's actually a testimony to their genius. The words that we have in the Gospels are a testimony to the genius of Jesus. And often we say, well, look, because he's God, therefore he knows everything, therefore he's genius. Now, yeah, sure, fine. But I don't mean that irreverently. I mean, that really is massive. But there is this further thing that we actually have evidence that we can share with people of his cleverness. I particularly think in the stories. I wrote this little book, Spies and Genius of Jesus, and I've given it to various non-Christian relatives of mine. And it begins with just this story in Luke 15, because who doesn't like a story? And I think we can actually share that story with people, and they can see in it all sorts of, they ought to be able to see in it, just cleverness. And at least get them to the point they say, well, that's a really amazing story.